baby boomers.
I used to be with it.
Millennials.
Okay, boomer.
Generation X.
What's going on?
And Gen Z. What do they have in common? Not a lot, it turns out. But one thing they can agree on is that this is the political podcast they want to listen to. Welcome to Not My Generation, the political podcast that looks at political events, news, and happenings across the world and at home through a generational lens. Your hosts are Dr. Emily Stacy and Professor James Davenport, two political scientists from Rose State College. But the views expressed on this program are solely the views of the host and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. Coming up on today's program.
All global indexes of democracy show a decline in the U.S. democracy score.
I think people just crave governance, right? Just stable governance.
Politics has become so polarized, and one of the consequences of that is the politicization of virtually everything.
Speculation is the most fun thing to do in politics, right? And now, here are James and Emily. Good morning, Emily.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Excellent. It's 80 degrees in February.
No kidding, but not for too much longer.
Yeah, no, you're going to pay for it, right?
But we are recording just shortly after the South Carolina primary, which, as expected, Donald Trump won. I think one of the interesting takeaways from all of the analysis that I've seen so far is, yes, he won, but 40% of those voters
said no way,
not voting for him.
Ever.
Right?
Right. In any circumstance.
Yeah. If this had been Joe Biden and 40% of Democrat voters were not supporting him, the story wouldn't be, look, he's crushing his opponents. It would be, what's going on here, right?
There would be absolute hair on fire. In fact, we also have that possibility, in fact, tonight in Michigan, that Biden may, obviously take it, but not by too much. Sure. And so you have a Democratic Party that's just as concerned. But yeah, back to South Carolina. We love the politics of it all. So Haley, very adamant, right, about staying in at least through Super Tuesday, right. Although her funders, which you can tell me a lot more about, I'm quite sure, have noted that that after Super Tuesday, it looks like that they are no longer, they don't see a viable future for continuing to fund the campaign.
Here's what I wonder is are any of them committed enough to simply say, we're gonna be an anchor on Trump's candidacy, right?
Just a never Trump,
Let this play out through the primaries. Let he keep showing weakness by not winning, as large as perhaps people would think he should. Now, that's not going to win. Listen, I think the longer Nikki Haley stays in this race, the more she damages her long-term future in the Republican Party, unless Trump is actually convicted before the nomination or sometime between the nomination and the election, right?
Yeah, and she's got a big "I told you so" if that occurs, but man, I'm not holding my breath.
His first criminal trial is supposed to start March 9th, I think, right? And so we'll see. Right. We'll see. It's not. I'm sure they're going to do everything they can to drag that out. But we'll see how that plays out and see if that changes voters' behavior or attitudes as evidence and testimony of that trial comes out. Right?
Yeah. So, and I think it's interesting, right, that she's going to stay in through Super Tuesday. You've got a smattering of different states, different demographics, obviously vastly different demographics, than your first three or four contests. And so, I think she's hoping that with that diversity, that there is more of that never Trump vote.
And I have seen her more willing to confront Trump directly as this has went on, right?
He made it personal. I think whenever he went after the husband, I think that was the final straw. She kept it real kind of Southern and cute and bless your heart. And then he went after the husband who's deployed, and it was a no-go after that.
And so I just think she has some incentive just personally to drag this out. I think those that don't want Trump to be successful have an incentive to drag it out. But at the end of the day, these folks who are dumping this money in there are business people, and they're not going to keep sinking in money in a losing investment, right?
Right. And so you got to wonder if the Kochs are not amassing a secret kind of shadow third party run or, a no labels run. I assume not, but man,
we said,
I want to speculate.
We said last time, speculation is the most fun thing to do in politics, right? But we said last time that the senator from West Virginia, Manchin, has said that he's not going to run, right?
Romney has been silent, I noticed.
You could have. What if you had like a Haley Romney?
I would be okay with
campaign,
that.
Or
where's Jeff Flake at? Like Arizona, where did Jeff Flake go?
Right. So, there you could perceive some Republicans breaking off, absolutely, right, and saying, you know what, we cannot let Donald Trump be the face of our party again. I don't think they would win, but they could guarantee that Trump didn't win, right? And at this point, I'm wondering, are there some people who are that committed to saying Trump is enough of a danger, enough of a disaster for our party that we will take the hit?
I don't know if it's even a disaster to the party. I mean, yes, obviously it is, but more so than that, I think people just crave governance, right? Just stable governance. I think we're about to see exactly what you just talked about on full display at the end of this week and again next week with a potential government shutdown, right? A smaller one, perhaps a couple of agencies on Friday, but March 8th is, earthing, as the children say colloquially.
So what do you get?
And that's Trump's chosen speaker.
What do we get if at the end of this election cycle, Joe Biden is reelected, but the Senate reverts to Republican majority and the House stays Republican? What do we get after that? A stalemate? Are people going to figure out how to work together?
It depends on what flavor of Republican you get, right? What kind of majority you cobble together.
That's exactly right.
Unfortunately, I don't know. You have the weaponization of the primary process at this point, right? If anybody has gone against the MAGA brand, they've been primaried by somebody to the right of them. And so that's becoming a big danger, in these state races. So we'll just kind of have to see what kind of majorities cobble together. Yeah. Are you or your organization looking for unvarnished, unbiased scholarly political analysis for your op-eds, candidates debates, or interviews regarding all things political?
Well, look no further. We are the Democracy Slingers. We're here to host, comment, educate, or just preach the good word of American politics to your school, club, company, or organization. Get in touch with us at democracyslingers@gmail.com. All right. Well, you had the opportunity to interview someone. So at Rose State, we do a book club in our social sciences division that you help head up. And you chose the book this semester, How Democracies Die. It's by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. And tell us a little bit about the book. And then we're going to play that interview that you got to do with Stephen Levitsky.
Yeah, fabulous guy, Harvard scholar, comparativist, which, I am as well. And so it's the book really just kind of dives into over time, over history, really, how democracies have declined over throughout the international community. So what kind of circumstances need to be present in order for democracies, once stable democracies, to decline? A lot of that is electoral. A lot of it is exactly, what we're talking about and what we continue to talk about within the American politique and obviously on this podcast as well. Dr. Levitsky, you call me Steve, he says, just a wonderfully humble scholar. I find most of us academics are pretty self-deprecating. And so we love to talk about our work, but we hate to talk about ourselves. But this guy was just incredibly bright and a real pleasure to speak to. So How Democracies Die was written in 2017, published in 2018. So the interesting thing about it is, he's skeptical. Kind of the underlying conclusion is he's skeptical about American backsliding, the American democracy backsliding. And of course, in 2018, we haven't even come to, right? Stop the steal. We haven't come to 2020. Right. We haven't come to January 6th. And so we also discussed their more recent work, Tyranny of the Minority, which does kind of focus on that really tiny part, that 1/3 of the Republican base that is that MAGA brand that seems to be running everything, influencing absolutely everything, including, like we just mentioned, a government shutdown, to who wins
funding
this next
for
election.
the Ukraine war, all of this kind of stuff, right?
So yeah, a really interesting conversation. I could have spoken with him forever, but of course, a Harvard scholar is very busy.
They're usually kind of busy,
yes,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are grateful that he took the time to speak with us. So
well, let's go to that interview.
I am Steve Levitsky. I am a professor of government at Harvard University, and I'm the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard.
Let's just go ahead and get started. I'm really very interested in speaking to you just specifically because I am a comparativist myself. And so whenever I saw that David Collier was your advisor, I died a little bit. And right. So I've like all around, MPSA. I am a huge fan. I've got Passion, Craft, and Method on my desk. I have my comparative. I'm teaching comparative right now. I have my kids do kind of book reports on the various theorists. So I just revere. I'm so just fangirl out on you. So thank you for being here with us or with me at this very moment.
David Collier, that should be clear. He was an amazing advisor.
I can imagine. And so did that, did you start in sort of the democratization kind of subject area or kind of subfield of comparative, or do you regard yourself as a comparativist? I guess I should ask.
Oh, yeah. I'm a Latin Americanist.
Yeah.
Which is why I worked with David. I got into this business as an undergraduate in the 1980s as a student at Stanford with Terry Carl and Philippe Schmitter.
Yeah.
During I was a freshman in college the year that, Donald Schmitter Transitions from Authoritarian Rule volume came out. And that sort of changed my life. Yeah. So that's how I moved a little bit away from regimes as a graduate in my dissertation, but spent most of my career studying democratization.
That's very cool. Would you just, as a nerd, would you do your doctoral work on?
The transformation of Peronism in Argentina, the party adaptation, how labor-based parties adapted to the neoliberal revolution of the 1990s.
Nice, man. That's very deep.
It's fun.
Extremely deep. So I kind of regard myself more as like a general comparativist. So I don't really have a regional specialty. I studied a little bit in Ukraine, 2011 through 2012 or 2010 through 2011. So that's kind of got a place in my heart. I've done quite a bit of research there. But I predominantly focus on social movement theory. And so that's why I love Latin America, why I love, South America, the Middle East, et cetera. So I'm very much about people's power and the way that we use available technologies. So that's why Scotch Paul that's why I followed her around. But I very much revere what you do. So tell me about your new work before we get into the questions. What are you working on currently?
My scholarly work, so Zivlot and I just came out with this second book in September, and we have spent a lot of time kind of peddling the ideas in that book. But my scholarly work is a new book with Luke and Wei on democratic resilience across the world, why democracies have actually proven more resilient than people think.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty early stage of that, but that's what I'm going to be focused on the next couple of years.
I hope that you are correct, my friend. So
Me too.
Do you regard yourself as an optimist then, or not an idealist, but sort of on the optimist end of realism?
I tend to confuse people because I come off, I'm not sure I call myself an optimist. Sure. I come off as an optimist globally and a pessimist locally in the United States. And people think because of how democracies die and because I'm very worried about U.S. democracy, people lump me automatically in this democracies dying all over the world camp, which I'm not. Yeah. I wouldn't call myself an optimist, but I think that I see the glass sort of mostly half full, or in globally in the last 20, 25 years.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. So that kind of leads into the first question. So your research, obviously, as we just mentioned, focuses on democratization and the conditions which democracies fail and decline. So your book, How Democracies Die, is what we're reading for our political science and liberal arts book club. Was published in 2018. And in it, you're skeptical, right, about the backsliding of American democracy, as you just mentioned. So again, how have things changed? Are you still skeptical? How do you feel as we're moving into closer to November of this year? What's your temperature on democracy?
I would say I am more concerned today than I was in when we wrote the book in 2017. We were obviously concerned enough to write the book, and anytime you a country elects a leader who is not committed to democracy, there's cause for concern. But I think it's fair to say things have gotten worse more quickly than we anticipated. I mean, first of all, when we wrote How Democracies Die, that was an exercise in concerned speculation. Not much had happened yet, other than the fact that we had just elected somebody who we believed, I think we were right, was not committed to democratic institutions.
Yeah.
But the U.S. hadn't really experienced any backsliding since as of 2017 when we wrote. But it did experience backsliding between 2016 and 2020. All global indexes of democracy show a decline in the U.S. democracy score since 2016. Just to take one example, Freedom House has a global freedom index that scores every country in the world annually from a low of 0, like North Korea, to a high of 100. A decade ago, in the second Obama term, the U.S. score was 92, which is not the highest in the world, but pretty good, solidly democratic, and on par with Japan and Italy and the UK and Germany broadly. Today, the U.S. score is 83. Which is still sort of above the bar for democracy, but that's a pretty significant decline. And it puts us tied with Romania and below Argentina. And that may seem shocking to people, but when you have pretty widespread efforts to restrict access to the ballot, when you have violent threats against election workers, against elected officials, against prosecutors, and of course, when you have an effort by the incumbent president to overturn the results of an election, you fall to the point where Freedom House considers you less democratic than Argentina, because that stuff doesn't happen in Argentina. Right. So we have experienced backsliding. The other thing that has occurred much more rapidly and thoroughly than I anticipated in 2017 is let's call it the Trumpization of the Republican Party. When we wrote How Democracies Die, the Republican Party, we considered the Republican Party a small d Democratic Party, a party that was by and large, we faulted the Republicans for failed gatekeeping and not doing everything possible to keep Trump out of office. But we believed that the Republican Party leadership was small d Democratic. And we believe that the Republicans had in their ranks leaders, particularly in the Senate, people like McCain and Romney and Corker and many others, who would be able to sort of draw a line and contain Trump. That didn't last very long. And the transformation of the Republican Party over the last 7 years has been nothing short of stunning. And it's reached the point where I think as of 2020, 2021, we can now say, in fact, we do say in our more recent book, Tyranny of the Minority, that the Republican Party, by and large, is a party that is no longer committed to democracy. A huge change from 7 years ago. And if you want, we can get into exactly how we come to that conclusion. Yeah. But when one of two major parties is no longer committed to democratic rules of the game, democracy is under a real threat. And that is a more dangerous position than we were in 2016, 17, when we elected an autocratic president, but seem to have two minimally democratic parties.
Yeah. So how do is there a way to combat this? Is there a way to, thwart what seems inevitable? You have people who need to read your book, obviously, but are likely not. We know that there are echo chambers. People like to stick to their media sources and pat themselves on the back for pre-established beliefs and being so smart. How do we fix this misinformation, disinformation? How do we fix the democracy? I know. I'm sorry. That was a big one.
Ideas for fixing democracy. The information and misinformation problem is very real and very serious, and it makes this process of defending democracy much more difficult. I mean, democracy is always vulnerable to threats from within. One of the inherent features of democracy is that it's open. It gives space for individuals and groups who may use that space to undermine democracy. So democracy is always at risk of electing demagogues, of electing potential autocrats. And the key is finding the antibodies within the democratic system to combat it. And we, both in How Democracies Die and in Tyranny of the Minority, we advocate for the construction of a broad, small d democratic coalition to isolate and defeat the autocrats. So basically, MAGA forces need to be defeated by a broad coalition that spans way beyond the large D Democratic Party and way beyond blue states, but includes conservative religious groups, conservative business groups, and as many conservative Republicans and former Republicans as possible. Building a coalition is much harder today than in the past because, as you said, many people, particularly the most politically active people, the people we need, are stuck in their echo chambers. But and so it's really hard. But we view our work as we view it as essential that we reach the a really important sector. It may even be a sliver of our society at this point, who are people who are principled conservatives and committed to democracy. If we can reach those people and get them on board and convince them of the importance of this, that may be enough. And so, just to give you one anecdote that keeps me going, I met Liz Cheney, I think a couple of years ago. And she told me that she and the 10 House Republicans who voted for Trump's impeachment had all read and discussed our book.
Awesome.
That's pretty cool. And but more importantly than it being cool is that it suggested that these ideas are reaching some people. They're not going to reach hardcore MAGA folks.
Sure.
There's a third of the country that we are never going to reach. We don't need to reach 100%. We need to reach 55, 60%. We need to reach Romney Republicans and Cheney Republicans and Bush Republicans. And I think that is possible.
Yeah, I agree. So the next question is written by my libertarian colleague who is not here. So I'm going to ask you this. Most concerns about democracy in the U.S. are in relation to what might be viewed as illiberal or even authoritarian aspects on the right. But there is also an illiberal strain on the left as well. Can you give an example of that? And how can we talk about democracy in our hyperpolarized era without seeming overly partisan? And that's something that I probably concerns both of us, or all of us really, as professors.
Yeah, no, the second one is hard, unfortunately. I mean, the politics has become so polarized, and one of the consequences of that is the politicization of virtually everything.
Yeah.
And so universities have been politicized. Everybody is sort of tagged and placed in a camp. And so if I'm from an elite university, it's automatically assumed that I support the Democrats, that I'm on the left, and I can't be taken seriously as a scholar, which kind of sucks because I spent a lot of time, earning my PhD and becoming a specialist in political science, to just be dismissed as a partisan hack because that's the way our politics are configured these days. Kind of sucks. So, ultimately, there are certainly things that we can do to kind of maximize our credibility and make sure that we're not, that obviously we call out abuses and the liberalism on the left as well as the right. There are good social science reasons to do that. But first of all, I'm not a journalist. It's not my job to cover both sides.
Exactly.
And second of all, I'm a scholar. And so I have to call things as I see it. And if in the United States today, the primary threat to democracy is coming from the far right, then it's my job to say that. I need to be persuasive. I need to provide data. I need to convince. But it's not my job to play both sides.
Yep.
It's my job to identify threats to democracy. And in my view, the overwhelming threat to democracy today in the United States, not at all moments in history, but today in the United States, comes from the right. Now, I'm not saying that the left can't threaten democracy. The left is equally capable, looking at the world and looking at history, equally capable of being corrupt, dishonest, rule-breaking, and authoritarian.
Sure.
And in our books, we call out either semi-loyal or authoritarian behavior on the left in Spain in the 1930s, Chile in the early 1970s, obviously Hugo Chavez's Venezuela. There are many cases. So they're far from arguing that the left is incapable of authoritarianism. It is equally capable of authoritarianism. In the United States, the liberal left is tiny. The most important actors in our politics are the political parties and the party leaderships. And so we focus, those are the ones that, as opposed to, say, 19-year-old students at Yale or Antifa protesters in Portland.
Right.
Yeah, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, and the Republican counterparts. Those are the political actors principally that are most important for preserving preserving our democracy. And so we look primarily at the behavior of our political leaders, elected officials. And on that front, I think it's quite clear that the Democratic Party has a 1,001 shortcomings and problems and things you can criticize. But it is a standard sort of center-left political party that has good days and bad days, good leaders and bad leaders, wins some elections, loses some elections, but has behaved completely according to democratic rules of the game. And that's not true of the Republican Party. And it's increasingly not true of the Republican Party. We've gotten to a point where virtually every important figure in the Republican Party today is willing to publicly endorse a candidate who may, even if he is convicted of trying to overturn an election. So an openly authoritarian figure is now being backed by almost the entire Republican Party. So the gap between the two parties is enormous. And I really, I don't think there's a both sides story. Is there a liberalism on the left? Sure. You can find liberalism on the left and in a wing of Black Lives Matter. You can find it on campuses, but politically it is weak. There is no political force capable of contesting seriously in elections in the United States on the left that I would consider a liberal or anti-democratic.
Yeah. And you haven't had the FBI kind of designate, the far left in the same way that they have far right groups as enemies or as potential threats to national security. So,
oh, and what's important is, I mean, there are always going to be elements of a polity of society that that either engage in violence or condone violence or engage in anti-democratic behavior or condone anti-democratic behavior. What's really important is that mainstream political parties openly denounce and separate themselves from that behavior. It is when mainstream political parties, center left or center right, it's when they condone, make excuses for, justify, protect, or even remain silent over anti-democratic extremist behavior in their own camp that we get into trouble. And on that front, I think the Democratic Party leadership has been pretty good.
What's your conclusion in Tyranny of the Minority? What's kind of the thesis and overall findings or conclusion?
There are two. One is that the first half of the book is about why the Republican Party went off the rails. It is it's a very unusual thing for a political party, a mainstream conservative party that's been competing peacefully in elections for a century and a half to suddenly turn away from democracy. That doesn't happen very much. We had actually a very difficult time researching the book, finding comparable cases. Ended up with a case in Thailand and the Democratic Party during Reconstruction. It does not happen very often. So the first half of the book is an effort to explain why that happened, why this party went off the rails. And we ultimately conclude that it is fear of losing in a couple of senses. The Republican Party, in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Revolution, very, very successfully over a generation appealed to white voters, especially, but not exclusively in the South, who were discontented with the changes in society brought about by the Civil Rights Revolution, and by efforts to attack and transform long established social hierarchies in this country. And so the Southern whites had for a very, very long time been overwhelmingly Democratic. Though that base of the Democratic Party was discontented after the passage of the civil rights reforms, and the Republicans, like any reasonable political party, went after those votes between 1964 and 1988. For about a generation, the Republican Party actively sought racially conservative white voters and succeeded at that goal. So in every election since I have been alive, and I'm 56, the Republicans have won a majority of the white vote. The Southern whites went from being overwhelmingly Democratic to being overwhelmingly Republican. And that transformation allowed the Republicans to go from being a minority party during the New Deal to being America's majority party in the latter part of the 20th century. The Republicans won every presidential election between 1968 and 1988, with the exception of the Watergate election in 76. That's a pretty good run. So the Republicans essentially became America's white Christian party, very successful in the late 20th century. The problem was that at the same time that the Republicans were becoming America's white Christian party, America was becoming less white and less Christian. And demographic change eventually got the party into trouble. The number of people who identify as white and Christian was 80% in 1976. It was 43% in 2016. And so that made it harder and harder for the Republicans to win national majorities. In 1980, Reagan wins 55% of the white vote, wins a landslide election. 32 years later, 2012, Romney wins 59% of the white vote and loses the election. When Republicans realized that they were winning the white vote and losing the American vote, they started to panic. But the fear of electoral defeat, though important, was, I think, less important than what was happening at the base. What was happening at the base of the Republican Party was a fear, in effect, that the country that many white Christians had grown up in was being taken away from them. Mm-hmm. That the dramatic transformation of our country into what is increasingly a truly multiracial democracy in the 21st century and the dramatic assault on long established racial hierarchies in this country has been threatening for those who were, for a long time, whose group sat on the top of social, economic, cultural hierarchies. And so many Republican voters, many Trumpist voters feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that's not just disagreeing with healthcare policy. That's not just disagreeing with foreign policy. That is a sense of existential threat. And that has radicalized the Republican Party from below. And there was a survey carried out by sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute in early 2021, found that 56% of Republicans agreed with the statement that the way of life, the American way of life, is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to stop it. A majority of Republican voters. So the party radicalized from below for a bunch of reasons, but principally, in our view, in reaction to the very real transition to multiracial democracy that this country is experiencing. Second part of the book, very quickly, turns to our institutions. And we argue that the Republican radicalization actually wouldn't be as problematic if we were like other democracies where majorities govern. Because for the first time in the history of this country, solid majorities now embrace the core principles of multiracial democracy. 60% of Americans consistently say they believe that the diversity of this country makes us a better place. The vast majority of Americans agree with laws combating discrimination, et cetera. A solid majority of Americans has always supported Black Lives Matter. That was true during the protests. It is true today. And a majority of Americans have always, every single day since Donald Trump came down that golden escalator, a majority of Americans have opposed him. But the problem is the United States had that majority, that emerging multiracial, small d democratic majority, has hurled itself against some of the world's most counter-majoritarian institutions. The United States has more than any other established democracy in the world, enables partisan minorities to consistently and sometimes permanently thwart the will of majorities, and in some cases govern over majorities. And so the book looks at why that's the case, why the United States is so counter-majoritarian, shows how other countries across the world over the last century and a half have gradually become more democratic, have gradually eliminated or weakened institutions that thwart electoral majorities, and how the United States is not, how the United States has increasingly become a democratic laggard in the world. And we argue that this excessive counter-majoritarianism has kind of protected the Republican Party, enabled it to win and hold power while it only winning 46, 47, 48% of the vote, which has been a disincentive for the party to adapt and broaden its appeal. But it's also gradually nudging us into minority rule, which is very, very dangerous. And so in the final chapter of the book, we present 15 reforms, some of them constitutional, some of them not constitutional, aimed at empowering democratic majorities in the United States.
Fantastic. I will ask you one last question, and it's a nerdy question. And I can't wait to get my copy of that book. It's on, it's in Amazon supply chain, currently coming to me. I'm very excited to get it and to utilize it in international relations in the fall. So my last question for you, I want to nerd out just a little bit. What are the long-term implications of the current international environment, right? The conflicts, the crises that are going on, Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Gaza, China, et cetera. you mentioned that kind of on the whole, democracy tends to be sustaining, right, globally. Do any of these challenges pose a risk to that?
Sure. So, I mean, first of all, I should say I'm not an international relations scholar, so I'm a total amateur when I talk about geopolitics. But globally, I think we sometimes forget in our global pessimism, we forget just how unusual the world was in the 1990s. So a lot of us today were educated, or our formative years were during the 1990s. This was a period in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, in which for about 15 years, the United States and the EU were the world's dominant political, economic, ideological, military force. The liberal West was the only game in town between about 1989 and maybe the Iraq War, early parts of the 21st century. Mm-hmm. The liberal West was dominant, and that was the period. That was the most favorable international environment for democracy in the history of the world. In fact, we'll probably never again see an environment like it. It's during that period that the number of democracies in the world more than doubled, just expanded, and democracy reached places where it had never reached before, which is great. But that was never likely to persist, that international configuration. The rise of China, the inexorable rise of China was going to happen, and other powers were also going to emerge. We were not going to stay a unipolar world dominated by the United States and Europe forever. Without question, the West has scored some self goals that have accelerated the relative decline. Point to the Iraq War, point to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the election of Trump. We've done some things to accelerate the process, but this was going to happen. We were in the 21st century going to move from a world dominated by the liberal West to a more multipolar, contested world. Mm-hmm. And that was going to, without question, have a couple of consequences. First of all, probably it was going to lead to some geopolitical conflict and military conflict, when changes in the balance of power in the world. And here again, I remind you that I'm a total amateur when it comes to geopolitics, but changes in the balance of power in the world often do lead to military conflict. That shouldn't shock us. But also, the world has become less favorable to democracy. Again, if you go back to 1995, the liberal West was the only game in town. If you were a poor country, government of a poor country that needed diplomatic support, economic assistance of any kind, you pretty much had to be on good terms with the West. Yeah. And that's just no longer the case today. And so the kind of external pressure or external encouragement for democratization or for democracy that existed 30 years ago simply doesn't exist today. Yeah. It's not the worst ever environment for democracy, but it's a lot less good than it was in the 1990s. Sure. So I think, first of all, given that, democracies have performed pretty well. We talk a lot, we wring our hands a lot about democratic backsliding and democratic recession and authoritarian resurgence. That's mostly bullshit. There are 6 fewer democracies in the world today than there were at the peak of democracy 15 years ago or so. And there are still more democracies today in the world than there were in the 1990s, and many, many, many more democracies today than there were in the 1980s. So, and given that the international environment has gotten a lot less favorable, I actually think that's a pretty good, really pretty resilient performance. Now, these wars, again, unfortunately, wars happen in the world. Wars happen when there is a changing balance of power in the world. I do think the war in Ukraine is very consequential. Here, I have very very mainstream views. I have nothing new to say, but a Russian victory in Ukraine will be a blow to the liberal West. The liberal West has had a rough decade in terms of its self-confidence, in terms of its international prestige, not only in the world, but within countries itself, right? For the first time since World War II, the basic tenets of Western liberalism are being challenged from within by far right parties, by getting back to who's illiberal, who's not, by illiberal forces on the political right. They have been mostly contained in Western Europe so far, but they've governed the United States, and they threaten to govern the United States again. I see that, like many others, as a real threat to the democratic West.
All right. Interesting. Very good conversation.
Excellent. Yes, I agree. I would love to pick his brain. I will likely send him lots of emails, and we'll perhaps have him back in the future to discuss future works.
Yeah, I am. When I read books like this, one of the things that I am very, very cognizant of is who is this book written to? Yeah. And every time I read one of these, I'm like, it seems to me like the people who need to be reading this either are not going to, or are going to read it and just say, oh, this is just a hack job from another elite, college educated person who doesn't like Trump and such. And so, I know he was resistant to that question that we posed to him about this, but it seems to me that sometimes some of the ways that we approach this, if we're not careful, all we're going to do is harden those people into those positions. But it was a great conversation, wonderful insights that he provided. Yeah,
I agree. Interestingly, I think the anecdote about Liz Cheney actually reading this book, How Democracies Die, and the 10 of them who voted for the Trump impeachment, kind of using this text as a primer of what can happen. It was a really interesting moment, really cool as an academic. You don't have to reach everybody. You need to reach parts, right? You need to reach, cognizant, critically thinking parts of the electorate, which, when we get out of echo chambers, is more people than we actually think are out there listening.
Speaking of Liz Cheney, another possible third-party candidate. I don't wish. Know.
That would be cool. If a Cheney-Haley run, my goodness.
That would cause some interesting dynamics.
Yeah, it would. Right?
Yeah.
That would be
and how could you, unlike with some of these other third-party candidates that never get on the stage in the debates or whatnot, can Joe Biden avoid debating that kind of a ticket? I just don't think that would be possible.
No.
All right. Well, we appreciate everyone for listening. This has been a great program, wonderful opportunity to interview. Again, the book is How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. We encourage you guys to get it, read it, and shoot us an email about your thoughts about it as well, right? They can reach us at notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu. Mm-hmm. And don't forget,
democracy is not a spectator sport.
See you later.
Bye. We love communication that goes both ways, not just you listening to us pontificate. We would love to hear from our audience. If you have comments, suggestions, or would like to contact us about possibly being a guest on the show, please email notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu.